Welcome back. A judge will hold a hearing tomorrow on whether to appoint a special master to sift through the documents taken from former President Trump's Mar-a-Lago home in that FBI search a few weeks ago. In the meantime, though, the Director of National Intelligence is conducting a damage assessment about the classified records found in the previous set of boxes, as I understand it. That's according to a letter obtained by CNN.
CNN security correspondent Josh Campbell is following all of this. So Josh, we know some of the degree of the top secret documents and others contained in that first batch picked up in January, including some of the very highest levels. How would a damage assessment work here?
Well, this is important, and it's important to note that this is separate from the ongoing DOJ criminal investigation into those documents at the former president's home. Now, the U.S. intelligence community, particularly the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, this is the entity that oversees the 18 components inside the U.S. government that cover intelligence, they have now launched this damage assessment. Their goal is to try to determine what was in these documents that was located and recovered by the FBI, and also what potential harm could there be to U.S. national security if that information was disclosed to people without a need to know, without authorization. Our colleague Jeremy Herb obtained a letter that was sent from the DNI to Congress recently. I'll read you part of that letter. She says that her office and the Department of Justice are working together to facilitate a classification review of relevant materials, including those recovered during the search. ODNI will also lead an intelligence community assessment of the potential risk to national security that would result from the disclosure of the relevant documents. And just to remind our viewers what was in this material that was previously recovered by the FBI, according to the search warrant affidavit, we're talking about items that included top secret information, items that included information that had the control markings of human source intelligence. This is among some of the most highly classified information in the federal government. You know, I can tell you, having worked in the intelligence community before, overseas, doing joint source debriefings with the CIA, whenever you gather information from a source and you send that to CIA or FBI headquarters, you pray that that information will be properly handled based on these protocols that are put in place. Here, the question is, how was that information there at Trump's residence? Why was it there? We now know that the intelligence community is conducting that damage assessment to see if there was a threat to national security with those documents being located there in Florida. Jim and Poppy.
All right, Josh Campbell, thank you for those updates. This morning, the district attorney in Fulton County, Georgia, has one final chance to file an argument in the battle over whether Senator Lindsey Graham should be compelled to testify before that grand jury. The South Carolina Republican is leaning on the speech and debate clause of the Constitution to try to get out of answering any questions before the grand jury about attempts to overturn the 2020 election results in Georgia. Let's begin there with CNN legal analyst Elliot Williams. He's a former federal prosecutor and the former Deputy Assistant Attorney General. Good morning. I should note for folks, this is a completely separate probe in Georgia, but this grand jury has heard from a lot of key folks, and Lindsey Graham is saying, no, I don't have to answer questions before this grand jury because the calls that I made to Brad Raffensperger about, any ballots and being tossed out, et cetera, was part of my job as a lawmaker, right? And if you look at the speech and debate clause of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 6 says, for any speech or debate in either house, they, meaning the lawmaker, shall not be questioned in any other place. But that's in civil suits. Would that hold up here, do you think, in this grand jury probe?
Yeah, it's sort of like everybody's kind of right on this, and it's a complicated legal issue. Look, the speech or debate clause really does protect much of what members of Congress do. It was started or put in place to prevent members of Congress from being sued for things like defamation, for things they say on the floor of the House of Representatives. And Poppy, it's gotten expanded beyond that really protects anything members of Congress are doing when they are doing their jobs. The question is, are you doing your job as a member of Congress when you're placing phone calls on behalf of another political candidate? And it's a little bit of a stretch, to say the least, to say that any single thing a member of Congress does simply because they're a member of Congress ought to be protected. Now, they're going to have to go back and forth on that. My guess is that the court would probably say there are some statements of Lindsey Graham's that would be protected, or some actions that would be protected, but most of it he'll have to testify.
Okay, so listen to this from Lindsey Graham over the weekend.
Yeah.
If there's a prosecution of Donald Trump for mishandling classified information after the Clinton debacle, which you presided over and did a hell of a good job, there'll be riots in the streets.
What is the significance of saying something like that at this moment? Elliot, when the heat is already so elevated? Something even, by the way, President Trump acknowledged. Remember when his lawyer called the DOJ just after the Mar-a-Lago raid?
That's exactly the point, that acknowledgement. Poppy, sadly, that's an unremarkable statement at this point, following January 6th, where the nation saw wide-scale political violence, for lack of a better way to put it, in the form of a riot tied to an election. And it's hard to see how there would not be a similar result. Now, look, that can turn into crimes beyond just the acts of rioting if people engage in acts of violence to obstruct the justice process. That's obstruction of justice in its purest form. It's very sad that we're here, but that's where we are.
So the other issue at hand here is one of former President Trump's requests, and that's that a special master be appointed to basically sift through these new boxes that were taken from Mar-a-Lago on the August 8th search and decide what is privileged, attorney-client privilege between the president and his counsel. But you make a great point that I had not thought of, that's sort of like the obvious, why this might not work here for this specific request. Can you explain?
There's a lot of reasons why, Poppy, this could not work for a specific request. But to be clear, it's never been done before because we don't usually have cases where former presidents are accused of having sensitive documents in their house. Think about all the different reasons why. Number one, the FBI has had these documents since August 8th. So right there, they've already gone through the documents and claiming privilege of them might be moot. Number two, who actually asserts executive privilege? Is it the current president or the former president? Number three, these are executive privilege documents, as he's saying. Most of the cases that have dealt with this before have been attorney-client privilege documents, which is something totally different. Yes, it has a privilege as well. Number three, who are you even going to get to be a special master here? It would have to be somebody who, number one, has a very high security clearance. Number two, understands these arcane and complicated legal issues. And number three, isn't seen as politically tainted. That's literally nobody in America who could, I think, effectively do this job well. It couldn't be a former attorney general of the United States. They'd all be seen as too political. It couldn't be most former senior government officials. So how would you get anybody to do it? So there's just a lot of problems that would have to be litigated. It's sort of surprising that the judge went there.
Well, it might have to happen, right? Because the judge did say that she's got preliminary intent to say yes here. So we'll see.
Yeah, she left open the door to it, yeah.
Elliot Williams, thanks, as always.
Poroshenko. Mr. President, thanks for joining us this morning.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
So first, on this potential counteroffensive, do you believe Ukraine has the capability and the forces necessary to gain back Russian-controlled territory?
First of all, I'm proud that for the last 8 years, the process of creating of Ukrainian new armed forces based on the NATO standard was started by me as a Supreme Commander-in-Chief in the year 2014. And this is the long-awaited counteroffensive operation, which was started today at 7 a.m. with a shelling and missiles attack. And this is first time since February 2022 when such a concentrated of Ukrainian troops with the Western artillery and with the Western HIMARS and Western missiles was collected together for this counterattack. And I think that we demonstrated that Ukrainian forces using, as General Hodges said, 200% efficiency. And we just want to remind you, in the year 2014, me as a Supreme Commander-in-Chief released 2/3 of the occupied Donbass. And if you, first of all, we are very much grateful for the United States because all the artillery, all the ammunition, all the missiles and all the HIMARS is supplied by you and myself. Want to thank that we also preparing for this counterattack, and we supply 11 armed personnel vehicle. My charity foundation, there are lots of drones, lots of the special equipment, and this is make the activity of Ukrainian forces significantly more successful.
Okay.
And looks at the military history. We have 3 times when exactly at this place, Ukrainian forces provided against Nazis, against all others, very successful operation. We learn it, we understand how to do that, and we will win.
Mr. President, does this indicate, as you know, there have been some in the West who have said now's the time to negotiate, perhaps now's the time to talk ceasefire. Does this indicate that Ukraine has no intention to sue for peace, negotiate for peace at the current status of the front lines?
You cannot find out any nation in the world who wants peace more than we Ukrainians. Only me was on funeral of my friends, of my closest person, 10 times during the last 3 weeks. And with this situation, definitely, you should take into account that Putin understands only one language, language of strength. And this counterattack is definitely improving and strengthening our position. But for ceasefire, we need to have several factors. Point number 1, this is the throw away the Russian forces from Ukrainian soil. Point number 2, immediate releasing of the hostages. Thousands of Ukrainian hostages are kept by Russia by prisoners of war. And then we are ready to discuss the security matter, to provide what kind of security guarantee Russia needs. Because Ukraine don't need security guarantee for us. The only acceptable way is the full membership of Ukraine in NATO.
Yeah. Well, Petro Poroshenko, we wish you and your team safety in the midst of the ongoing war there. Thanks so much for joining the program this morning.
Welcome back. So House Republicans, at least some of them, growing pessimistic about their chances of winning a significant majority in the midterms. Last week's special election in New York's 19th congressional district was the latest sign of trouble. Democrat Pat Ryan defeated Republican Mark Molinaro in a swing district considered a bellwether for the midterms.
CNN's Manu Raju joins us now from Capitol Hill. And Manu, with the normal caveats about sometimes flawed polling and the fact that we're still a couple months out, Republicans looking at this and saying their advantages, at least clear advantages, have disappeared. What are they telling you?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, they're looking at the map, they're looking at the environment, and it's a much different environment than it was, say, a couple months ago before the Supreme Court ruling on Roe versus Wade, overturning Roe, something that has energized Democratic voters. And then Republicans are seeing some shifts, the special elections that you mentioned as well, that perhaps that their hopes of winning a landslide majority could be narrowed. Initially, last year, Kevin McCarthy, the Republican leader, bullishly predicted maybe a 60-seat gain in a chamber where they need to pick up 5 seats at the moment to retake the majority. Now some of the Republicans believe that they're looking at maybe a 15 to 30-seat gain, and potentially even a single-digit gain, and that essentially would have a significant ramification for the way Kevin McCarthy could push through his agenda. This is what one top Republican who's retiring, Fred Upton, a veteran Republican, told me last week. He said, I expect a narrow majority for the GOP that may not be all that much greater than what Nancy Pelosi has today. Will be very hard to have any sense of a governing majority. Now, the reason why that the margin is significant is that Kevin McCarthy first needs to secure the Speaker's gavel. We already know that there are a handful of Republicans who will not vote for him. He needs to get 218 votes to do just that. If he does not get that, he may have to cut deals. He may have to figure out another way to get the Speaker's gavel. We'll see how that shapes up. Also, passing an agenda, getting legislation through, dealing with things like avoiding a cataclysmic debt default, something they'll have to deal with in the new Congress, and something that they'll have to potentially deal with, get support within their own conference to get. Those are big questions that he will have to face going forward. Now, Republicans are still confident and optimistic that they will actually get the majority here, thanks to the map, thanks to historical trends, thanks to redistricting, but nevertheless still concerns that perhaps it doesn't look as good as it once did, even as they're still confident they'll get to the majority. Guys.
Just into CNN, the Fulton County, Georgia District Attorney asking a judge to once again deny Senator Lindsey Graham's request to block his subpoena to testify before that grand jury.
CNN correspondent Nick Valencia is in Atlanta with more. Nick, we've seen so much back and forth, right, on this testimony. What more does the filing say, and what happens next?
You got that right, Jim. This has been drawn out for weeks. A lot of legal wrangling and pushback by Graham's attorneys trying to keep him from having to appear before the special purpose grand jury. The Fulton County District Attorney's Office in a court filing today calling Graham's position an extreme position. And here's what they partially had to say in that filing this morning, saying Senator Graham's repetition of his previous arguments does not entitle him to partial quashal, and the district attorney respectfully requests that his motion be denied. They're effectively going on to say that he believes he's above the power of being questioned. Now, Graham and his attorneys are arguing that he is protected in a legislative capacity by the U.S. Constitution's speech or debate clause, and that he was operating in a legislative capacity as the then chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee when he placed 2 phone calls to Georgia's Secretary of State's office in the wake of the 2020 election. And one of those calls, if you remember, was directly with Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, and it was Raffensperger's interpretation of that call that Graham asked him to throw out legal ballots. Now, Graham and his attorneys have denied those allegations, calling them ridiculous. They're trying to keep him from having to appear before this special purpose grand jury. He's just the latest Republican, an ally of former President Trump, to try to get out of being questioned by Fani Willis, who's the district attorney in Fulton County. Now, what happens next is more legal wrangling. Graham's team has until August 31st, that's Wednesday, to respond to this, at which point a judge will have to rule whether or not a full quashal or a partial quashal for the subpoena is in order. Jim, Poppy?
Nick, thanks very much for that significant update. So let me bring in John P. Fishwick Jr., who's a former U.S. attorney for the Western District of Virginia, and also CNN counterterrorism analyst Phil Mudd. Thanks both very much for being with me. I guess let's just begin, because this news just came in about Lindsey Graham. And John, I would just ask you, I mean, it's interesting because Elliot Williams was saying last hour to us, like, the speech and debate clause argument could kind of go either way here for Graham, right? The question is, were these calls to Raffensperger about those ballots related to the 2020 election actually part of his job as a legislator or not, as a member of Congress or not?
I think you're right. I think it's going to be a close call, and it's going to be litigated for a while. It's going to be back and forth between the district court and the Court of Appeals. And ultimately, you know, the United States Supreme Court is going to weigh in on some of these issues as relates to these various Trump investigations. And for everybody who's investigating Trump, that's not a good thing, because these investigations need to be with transparency and also move forward quickly with alacrity. And so when you have these various evidentiary disputes, it will slow down investigations.
Phil Mudd, if I could turn to you on what we learned over the weekend, and that is that the Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, has told the House Intelligence and House Oversight Committees that they are going to do what is a formal damage assessment on the documents taken from Mar-a-Lago, not the ones taken on August 8th. This is the documents taken back when they got the first batch of 15 boxes, if you will, in May. What we know because of the affidavit is that in those boxes there were 67 documents marked confidential, 92 marked secret, 25 as top secret. What does a damage assessment really mean? And what question are they trying to answer by doing that?
Boy, this is a curious one, because typically if you're going to do a damage assessment, you know that something bad has already happened. And I don't mean somebody storing documents improperly. I mean, for example, a spy giving away documents to the Russians. In this case, you're doing a damage assessment and you're not certain whether damage is done. We don't know, obviously, whether any of those documents left Mar-a-Lago or whether anybody inappropriate looked at them. We do know they were stored improperly, and I'm going to guess when the FBI and the Department of Justice look at videos from Mar-a-Lago, they're going to find people who did not have security access had access to those rooms. In other words, people who didn't have security clearances might have looked at the documents. So you don't know if damage is done. You know the stuff was stored improperly. I think the end result is going to be pretty interesting. It's going to be more of a political game than a security game.
Yeah.
The political game is the Democrats are going to get a piece of ammo saying this was nasty stuff, and the Republicans are going to get a piece of ammo saying it's not clear anything ever happened with it.
Sad thing about it is this is so much more important than politics. This is not supposed to be about politics. This is supposed to be about securing documents that have to do with our national security. John, thanks so much for agreeing to to come on. And Phil, as always. But John, the reason we reached out to you is because I was struck by what you told the New York Times a few days ago, and that is, you said, and I should know you were an Obama appointee, you said, I think anytime you search a former president's home, you've got to treat it with more transparency, and you need to disclose all the details with alacrity and quickness. And I just wonder, because that's where the fight is now, really within the political fight is, even with this affidavit that, a lot of it is redacted. Is there enough transparency here? Now seeing what we see and also seeing what's redacted, is there enough transparency from DOJ here?
I don't think there is. I think ultimately Merrick Garland's job here is to get buy-in from the American public that the investigation is being conducted fairly and transparently. And ultimately, the American people are the jury on this case. They need to know what the evidence is against a former president. Yes, a former president of the United States is different. We have to treat that person differently. And we need to make sure that Donald Trump is treated the same as Joe Biden would be treated if he left office. And so the American public needs to go out there. So I think they should absolutely release the affidavit of the search warrant. We need to know the specifics of this case. You can't just suddenly indict a former president without telling the public why.
Yeah. Right. No one's indicted yet. But Phil, I think John's referring to, there are full pages in this affidavit that are fully redacted. There's other parts that are not. So they've put it out there, Phil, but there's a lot, that they can't release because of the ongoing investigation, protecting sources and methods, protecting witness identity. Is that right, Phil?
I think so, and I could not disagree more with the assessment that they should be out open more. Let me give you two reasons why. We just went through Hillary Clinton. As soon as the Department of Justice opens a conversation with the press and the public, they have to continue the conversation and they have to close it about a person or persons, not just the former president, but also lawyers, for example, who are supporting him, who have not been charged. That is potentially doing a lot of damage to people as you raise their names in conversations by the Attorney General when they may never be charged. The other thing, and the Department of Justice said this repeatedly, as soon as you open more of that information, when you walk into a potential witness and say, don't worry, talk to us in private because your name will ever get out there. If I'm sitting across from the FBI and those agents, I'd say, get out. You cannot promise me confidentiality because you already showed you're going to violate your regulations by speaking to the press. Get out. I don't think Wade should ever speak again until they figure out what the heck they're doing.
Phil Meade, thank you. John Fishwick, good to have you. Welcome to the program. Thanks both very much.
Thanks so much.
Sure.
Watching the stock markets, they are down again slightly this morning, this after plunging more than 1,000 points on Friday. Why? Well, it's all tied to Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell's warning that the Fed would continue its historic pace of rate hikes for the foreseeable future. He worried that there will be some, quote, pain to households and businesses. This weekend, responding, Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts slammed those comments.
Do you know what's worse than high prices and a strong economy? It's high prices and millions of people out of work. I'm very worried that the Fed is going to tip this economy into recession.
CNN business correspondent Rahel Solomon joins us now. This is building on that op-ed she wrote a few weeks ago where she said, basically, mitigating inflation in the near term is not worth a whole bunch of layoffs, et cetera, that would come with a recession. And it was striking to hear Jerome Powell on Friday say, there is real pain for households ahead beyond inflation.
Yeah, I think his tone, his language, his messaging was striking to your point. He actually addressed this concern that Warren makes in those comments on Friday morning, essentially saying that the inflation that we're experiencing here in the U.S. is partially supply driven, as she pointed out, but it's also demand driven. And the interest rate hikes only work to combat the demand side, but that there is no room for complacency here. And that essentially the only other way to get through to the other side of the equation of inflation is these higher interest rates. And so according to the Fed's point of view is that there's no other way to get to lower inflation but these higher interest rates. And ultimately that should help the greater public in terms of lower prices.
We'll watch what happens at their next decision. Thank you very much.
A few weeks.
Rahel. So next.